To start with, David, we've just got news that China has called for a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, but up until very recently, the US was warning that China wanted to supply lethal aid to Russia. Can you help me parse those two seemingly conflicting bits of news?
I think it's all part of the same kind of murky story, which is that from the very first moment that Putin's tanks rolled over the border a year ago into Ukraine, China's official position is that it is neutral and that it is a high-minded, peace-loving great power that only wants to see both sides lay down their arms. But very quickly, when you spoke to Western diplomats here, not just Americans, but also from places like your own country or from Europe, they were pretty clear that China's neutrality was fake, that it was a pro-Russian pseudo-neutrality. And that was proved by the fact that for the last year, Chinese officials, Chinese diplomats, and China's propaganda machine have been pumping out Kremlin talking points, blaming the war on America, blaming the war on NATO, and saying that the only reason the war is still going on is because American arms dealers and energy companies are making such huge profits from the war. And so now China's pose of being this kind of peace-loving giant includes this call for a ceasefire, this talk for a political settlement. I think the suspicious detail, if you're a Western government, is that the Chinese consulted closely with the Russians on this. And we saw the top Chinese diplomat, Wang Yi, in Moscow talking to his Russian counterparts. But they have not asked the Ukrainians whether they want a ceasefire, because from Ukraine's point of view, they have Russian armies occupying illegally vast chunks of the east of their country. So to tell them to drop their weapons now and go to the table isn't an honest, good faith call for peace. It's a call for Ukraine to surrender vast chunks of its territory that it still has ambitions to take back from Russian troops.
Yeah, a very one-sided ceasefire there. So Putin and Xi have previously described their friendship as no limits. I'm just wondering, how literal of an expression do you think that is? And could that no limits friendship ever actually extend to a full military alliance, which has been a nightmare for the West for decades at this point?
So it's a fascinating question, because for the longest time, Chinese officials and Chinese scholars would say, we do not want an alliance with Russia, because the official version was that China doesn't have alliances with anyone. And of course, alliance in kind of political diplomatic code is a really specific term, essentially meaning that whatever your ally does, whether it starts a war or is invaded, you're essentially bound by sort of treaty to go to their aid and fight alongside them. And the official version was that China doesn't want that kind of alliance with anyone because it's a peace-loving giant. The off-the-record version was that Russia's just a bit too kind of wild and unpredictable for China to want to absolutely guarantee to be Russia's side, whatever it does. The change, and this is what you're hearing when the Americans release in this very targeted way intelligence saying that the Chinese appear to be willing potentially to sell arms, lethal aid to the Russians, is that for a country that says it doesn't want an alliance, doesn't want to be fighting alongside Russia, China is edging dangerously close to actually wanting Russia, if not to win the war outright, that China clearly sees a strong interest in helping Vladimir Putin avoid defeat. And so if you have the West pouring weapons into the Ukrainian side and the Chinese ever started pouring weapons in on the Russian side, it's very hard to not see that as the beginning of a kind of global Cold War. And I think that's why you're seeing the Americans talking about this in public, not because they think the Chinese arms are already in Russia, but they're just, as they did at the beginning of the war a year ago, they're releasing secret intelligence in a kind of last attempt to just show the Chinese that they're willing to go public with this and to try and stop the Chinese from taking this fateful step.
Well, it does seem we're taking these steps towards a precipice. How do Washington and Beijing de-escalate from here? What would you want to see?
So if you want to look back for kind of models of how two giant hostile superpowers could get along, you can look back at the US-Soviet Union's Cold War, which was very dangerous, very frightening. Your viewers will remember how sort of bad it was, and we feared for nuclear war. But on the most sensitive and dangerous topics like nuclear safety, like making sure there wasn't a misunderstanding about some nuclear exercise, there were moments during the Cold War where the militaries and the top leaders of the Soviets and the US and their allies could come together and say, okay, to avoid an accidental nuclear war, here is what we're going to say. There is a real concern at the moment that China and the US are closer to that kind of Cold War than they have ever been. But those mechanisms, that kind of machinery where the two sides can have grown-up conversations about lowering the temperature, about reducing tensions, about avoiding misunderstandings, all of those mechanisms are not in place. And a classic example of that is that something as essentially non-important as a Chinese spy balloon proved a huge political problem on both sides. Both sides felt that they had to talk very tough. Both sides have a completely different interpretation of what that was. The Chinese are still saying that it was an errant weather balloon, and it caused the cancellation of a visit by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to China, where he was due to see the only man who really takes big decisions around here, Xi Jinping, the supreme leader. So for something as kind of seemingly almost comic as a lost spy balloon, to knock that kind of engagement off the agenda shows you just how fragile those sort of tools for managing this relationship are. And that's a real concern.
To what extent can China actually literally afford to keep antagonizing the West, though? It's facing lowest GDP growth in decades, increasingly hostile trade relations, a rapidly aging population. What is the economic outlook for China, and how does that impact what we're discussing?
Look, it's a great question. I think to answer it, you have to define the West quite carefully. So I think there are forces in China who would like to try and divide the West. And so, they would come to a country like New Zealand and start by saying, why don't you be the good South Pacific friends, not like those awful aggressive Australians? And then why don't you be the good Westerners, not like those awful aggressive Americans who try and drag you into a kind of Cold War confrontation that you don't want? They're going to Europe. They're saying to the French and the Germans, why are you paying the price in high energy prices and refugees in your own streets coming out of Ukraine? You're being played by the Americans. It's the Americans that are the real problem here. So their first step is to try to divide the West and just kind of trade and get investments and technology from other countries. There is still some technology that they actually still need from America, although I think the hopes on the Chinese side are fading, that some of the highest end things like semiconductors will still be available from America, because we're now several years into first the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, really limiting some of those flows of the highest end technologies. So I think the Chinese still have things that they need economically, technologically from America, but also the whole of the West. They still have ambitions to divide the West. But although that's a huge interest, they also have this gigantic interest in becoming a kind of leader of the global South, of the developing world. And there you see the constant temptation for China to pump out the anti-American rhetoric and the anti-American talking points. And I think this peace deal, these discussions about Ukraine that you began with, is a classic example where China sees an opportunity to rally friends in Africa, in Latin America, in parts of Asia to say, why are we all allowing this Ukraine war to send our food and energy prices sky high? This is the awful, wicked Americans trying to maintain their hegemony. They're the biggest bullies, the most dangerous country in the world. And that is so popular in the global South that the temptation of pumping out more and more of that anti-Americanism is so powerful that you're seeing the Chinese putting in risk some of their economic relationships with countries in the West that, as you say so rightly, they do still need.
And so just to localise this for our viewers, David, China is our largest trading partner. Governments here of both stripes have have talked a big game about diversifying away from China, and it is yet to happen. What is it about China that makes it so difficult to disentangle from?
Well, the starting point is economics, right? The New Zealand economy and the Chinese economy are just a brilliant fit. You have good, high quality, clean food, milk powder, dairy products, meat. The Chinese have an enormously rapidly growing middle class, and middle class parents in big cities in China want to feed their kids safe, clean milk and meat. So that was a fantastic opportunity for New Zealand to play on its strengths. And for a long time, that didn't seem to carry any political risk at all. And so at the margins, maybe some people would say, well, is there, are there aspects of Chinese governance that we don't like, their human rights policies, but on the other hand, look at all the milk and food and other products that we're selling them. I think what has changed in the last few years, and you can see this having an effect, a bipartisan effect, I would say, in places like New Zealand, but also say in Australia, is that China has shown that as it becomes more willing to challenge the West and more willing to say that it's willing to inflict pain on any country that challenges China's national interests. They're willing to use trade as a weapon. And so I think the wake-up call for New Zealand business the last couple of years has been watching the punishment dealt out to their brothers and sisters in Australia. So if you're a New Zealand winemaker and you see the Australian wine industry, which used to sell billions of dollars worth of wine into China every year, now hit with these enormous import tariffs that basically mean that Australian wine is now so expensive it's disappeared from the shelves. New Zealand winemakers, as far as I know from talking to New Zealanders here in China, they didn't say, oh, great, the Australians are suffering, so we'll jump in and steal their market. I think you've seen a very different impact, which is New Zealand business, New Zealand politicians, New Zealand diplomats saying, if China can do that to Australia, use trade as a weapon to punish Australia for essentially political disagreements, they can do that to us. And so we need to realize that even something as beneficial as our trade with China carries political risks that maybe people were naive about only a few years ago.
And you've touched on it there, but just to put a slightly finer point on it, China has been ramping up its efforts in the Pacific. What is it about the Pacific that makes China want to have a foothold here?
So China has ambitions to... So China has two big ambitions that affect the Pacific. One is that China's backyard is growing. China wants to push basically the Americans as far away from China's coasts as possible. And that used to be something that happened close in near Taiwan, maybe a bit in the South China Sea. But we can now see the Chinese Navy becoming a blue water navy. It wants to have global reach. It wants to have influence and security partnerships, places to refuel, places to dock its ships, down in the Solomon Islands, down in other Pacific islands. It wants to be the power that is providing technology and internet cables and telecoms in the Pacific Islands to buy influence. It sees countries like Australia and New Zealand now pulling back from some of their old partnerships with Pacific Island neighbors because, money is tight and people want to save on their budgets. And so China sees an opportunity to get in there. So that's part of it. I think also that the Chinese see a kind of global contest where if they can pull some of those Pacific Island countries into their political ambitions to redraw the rules-based order and to be allies and supporters at the United Nations in faraway New York, that is also very valuable because China is extremely pragmatic about the fact that in the UN General Assembly, every country gets a single vote. And so an island nation with a few tens of thousands of people, if they get one vote of the UN, China is very happy to open an embassy, invest in, funding their local media, start influencing their politics because they're a vote back in the UN the next time the Chinese are having a fight with America and other democracies about, the rules of the road for global trade and global politics. And so China is playing a regional influence game, but also a global influence game. And for both of those reasons, it sees an interest in investing massively in the Pacific, in your backyard.
All right, we're starting to run out of time now, David, but just a couple more quick questions. And to start with one that's a little bit more philosophical. China's earlier explosive economic growth seemed to come, at least in part, from embracing elements of free market capitalism, but Xi seems to be steering more towards rigid state control. What's more important to him, ideological purity in China or the world's most powerful economy?
I think we can see that he's willing to put the Communist Party's authority ahead of economic interests in places like the crackdown in Hong Kong, which scared a lot of foreign investors out of Hong Kong. But I think he's also very cynical. He thinks that those investors will come back if the growth is in China. And so he would say, in answer to your good question, we can have it all. We can have Communist Party total control of those bits of the economy that we think affect our national security and just enough market capitalism to make it dynamic. And as long as we're where the growth is, as long as we're where the customers is, countries like New Zealand, they will swallow their doubts about our political system and they'll come back to trade with us.
And finally, David, could I ask you to crystal ball gaze slightly and paint me the optimistic vision of where China is in 2050 and then paint me the pessimistic one?
The optimistic picture is that we have a different set of leaders, that the pendulum swings back. They realize the costs that come with being aggressive and having these wolf warrior diplomats losing friends all around the world. And so we see a calmer, older, grayer, perhaps less rapidly growing China that is just slightly less assertive and aggressive. The pessimistic scenario is that between now and 2050, we have a real crisis, and it could be something like a war over Taiwan. And then, we are into uncharted territory, because the pessimistic scenario is that China is a resentful, fast-growing country with naval warships and aircraft carriers pouring out of the dockyards every year, and the missiles being, sprouting up in bases all up and down the Chinese coast. And we've seen that story before in history, and it very rarely ends well.
Well, David Rennie, Beijing Bureau Chief for The Economist, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thank you.